So if you want to go back and review anything, or if you hopped on late or had to step out for a few minutes, you'll be able to catch up on whatever you missed. And we're so delighted to have you at this joint program with the Hidden Collection of Philadelphia Congregations and the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Welcome back, Carol.
Yes, I'd just like to echo Beth's words. Thank you so much for joining us, and to the newcomers, welcome. It's an exciting project, and we are just delighted to have you all be a part of it with us. And I know a number of you have already started doing a little bit of playing around with transcription, so I hope that you haven't found it too frustrating. But we'll get to all of your questions at the end. In the meantime, we sort of thought it might be helpful to hear from some folks who have been doing transcriptions for a long time. And we've invited them to speak about different groups of records within this project they've been working on. So the first person that is going to be talking is Jeanette Weir, who is the longtime historian of Gloria Dei Church. And Jeanette, I can see her screen is in her virtual background of the church, which is just beautiful, probably the oldest in the city, and its records go back to the 17th century. Jeanette has been struggling through the writing of many different ministers and clerks, Swedish as well as English, and has been doing it for quite a while. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jeanette, and we have a couple of the records that she wanted to talk about that Carly will be pulling up.
Right. Mostly today we're going to be talking about Nicholas Colleen's records. And if we could show the pictures of the marriages and whoever's putting it up.
Tess, does Carly have screen sharing privileges?
She should. Everyone should. Let me know if you don't, Carly.
Well, Nicholas Colleen, when he writes anything about the people, he really describes their history, their life, where they were from, what they've done. And he was with us for 45 years, and he married a lot of people during his time there. In his 45 years, he married 3,375 couples, which averages out to about 84 a year. And in 1795 alone, he married 199 couples. And back in the 90s, I transcribed our birth records and death records, and it was really amazing, all the different things. But here's the funeral records. And as you can see, for the 24th, it's talking about Britta and the wife of John Colvin. But over on this other page is Andrew Dom. And this whole item is just about his life, of him going back and forth to Sweden, what he did when he was here, and how his life was. So this is a typical Nicholas Colleen's item of how he would describe the different people. One of the things he had described was a woman who was in a rolling chair, as he marked it, meaning a wheelchair, and that she was always happy. So whenever you read anything about someone who died, you sort of knew who they were, and you felt like you knew them. With the marriage records, could we switch to that one, please? So here, I don't know if you can enlarge it, that we can read it a little bit. It talks about how people come. Oh, it's still the funeral records. He talks about how people come at the late hour of after the shutters were shut and the candles were extinguished to be married. It's not, you can't, I don't think most of you can read how he describes, but like how people will come and asking for marriage because they want to sail off the next day, because, you know, we were right there on the river, and the sailors needed to ship out the next morning. They wanted to get married, and how he actually refused to marry a lot of couples for that reason.
I just
But
wanted here, but not to interrupt you with saying this information. I can't zoom in on this, but you can, as an individual on your individual screens, zoom in to read by clicking on like different, like there's like a fit to window and like 100%, 50%, 150%, where it allows you to at least read it differently.
But this will give you an idea of some of the history that, you know, Colleen had wrote about the different people. What the fun part is now is we trying to translate the Swedish into the English. A lot of our records have been translated, and they were supposed to go exactly, but apparently they're not. So it's giving a little grief with the translating of the Swedish. Is there any questions on our records?
Jeanette told us that when she was transcribing the baptismal, marriage, and burial records for Gloria Dei, it took her 600 hours to put them into an Excel database. And I was laughing and saying to her, you know, if you had had a normal church's records, it might have only taken you 300 hours, because obviously some of your ministers were a little chattier than others.
Especially Colleen. Colleen was really chatty. But it was good because that way you got to know what the people were. And we do a lot of genealogy requests. And this gives information to the family about, you know, who their ancestors were and what they did, where they lived. So it's been really interesting. And translating some of the vestry minutes, we've been finding out some scandals that happened way back in the 1700s, and how they referred to some of the clergy back then as being lunatics. You know, so it's been really a lot of fun transcribing the records.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. If people have questions, you could just enter them into the chat and we'll get to them towards the end. Jean, do you want to start talking about some of the issues you've had with the records you've been working with? Jean Craig is another volunteer who has only been working with us since March, but what a treasure. We're delighted to have her. Jean has been doing this type of work in the past, I believe, but she can help fill you in on some of that as well. And she's one of our most faithful transcribers. Jean, you're muted.
Okay. I've only been doing this really since the beginning of April. One of my neighbors here, Alan Hasbrook, sent out an invitation for people to join, and if they needed something to do during shutdown. And so really that's as long as I've been in the group, and I'm learning something all the time. What I'm going to talk about, and if you excuse me, I'll read it because otherwise I fly off in all directions. One of the sermons of the Reverend Benjamin Dorr, D-O-R-R, who was the rector of Christ Church during the Civil War. President Andrew Johnson decreed a national fast day for June 1st, 1865, as a day for concentrated prayer, meditation by the entire country, wherever the national flag was flown and recognized, in order that the nation would be occupied in the same way, this to commemorate the assassination of Lincoln a month and a half previous, to repent of sin and to find ways of healing. Reverend Benjamin Dorr had been the rector of Christ Church for 26 years, since 1839. An illustrious predecessor, Reverend and later Bishop William White, had led Christ Church and St. Peter's for 57 years and had died in 1836. Both Reverend White, and as Anglican priest, then as American Bishop of Pennsylvania, and Reverend Dorr carried decades of responsibility for their flocks in changing times, and especially during times of turbulence, Reverend White with a congregation of Tories, those undecided, and the ones who espoused revolution, and Reverend Dorr, a congregation of Northerners who espoused the Union, those undecided, and the Southern-born or Southern sympathizers during the Civil War. Both strove to keep their congregations together in a church of a changing neighborhood and local economy, but which both men regarded as the nation's church, the church of the founders. And here I pay tribute to William F. Quigley, whose book, Pure Heart, The Faith of a Father and Son in the War for a More Perfect Union, gave me a lot of wonderful information about politics in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia at the time, which was just seething with disagreement. And I chose to talk about this National Fast Day sermon that Reverend Dorr prepared called The Death and Burial of Moses. I transcribed Reverend Dorr's copy of the sermon, which you see in front of you, which includes the text as he originally wrote it and his numerous editorial changes, whether crossouts or rephrasings or additions. The section on Moses, delivered first, is pretty much as originally written, straightforward, and shows Reverend Dorr's deep knowledge of the Bible and of the implications of the stories told there. When he turned to his discourse on Lincoln, however, pages or parts of pages were moved around, and in this working copy were partially replaced or added to, sentences were reworked, and individual words were changed for other words, showing how he wrestled with arranging and declaring what he wanted to say. Many of the changes were made to tamp down the satisfaction Reverend Dorr felt at the victory of the Union and the preservation of the United States. He had a personal stake in the win as well. His son, William White Dorr, named for the venerable Bishop White, had fought with great valor as part of the Pennsylvania 121st Volunteers, notably fighting in the first day at Gettysburg in 1863, July, and had died instantly of a gunshot to the heart, leading an advance during Grant's Overland or Wilderness Campaign and the struggle for Spotsylvania and its strategic crossroads in May of 1864. In his sermon, Reverend Dorr compares Moses and Lincoln, both leaders who were esteemed and respected, lawgivers, counselors who led their peoples through years of struggle and hardship, and both of whom died suddenly, just at the threshold of better times. Moses could not reach the promised land, but his work was done. Lincoln could not enjoy much of the new peace. In this sermon, at least, Reverend Dorr never mentions the Civil War by this name. He substitutes the word conflict. Most of what I'm talking about will appear on page 21. I don't know if we can get to that or not, but not to worry if we can't. He describes he substitutes the word conflict for rebellion. The quote, sudden and awful death of Lincoln, end quote, is revised to the death of Lincoln. Reverend Dorr objectifies Lincoln's death with Lincoln's swift passage to eternal life and says that it, quote, seemed to be the one thing necessary to cement our union together in an indissoluble bond, end quote. He crosses out what he had written next. Quote, there will be, we trust, no more rebellion, no more disunion. The nation will forever be one in heart and hand in resisting all attempts at its overthrow, end quote. He continues in his original text, quote, when the news of the assassination of the president first came to our ears, every loyal heart was filled with dismay, end quote. He replaces that sentence with mitigating words. When we first heard the announcement of the president's death, every heart was filled with dismay. He must praise Lincoln openly for his high character and unceasing effort during the struggles, who had given himself and more for 4 years to the country. Reverend Dorr crosses out the word sacrificed, but says Lincoln had been, quote, the chief instrument in God's hand for bringing his nation through all her trials, and that, quote, his work was done. He then quotes Washington. This is near the bottom of page 22 and going into page 23 and 24, who maintained that the invisible hand of God brought the nation through the trials of the revolution, and that Washington's words applied as well, if not more, to the recent struggle for, quote, our national existence, our very life. And you can see here on these different pages all the emendations, the editorial editions, some in ink and some in pencil, which he seemed to use a very hard pencil. It would be hard to read. And in other areas, some of the crossouts where he unburdened himself of his feelings, got them down on paper and externalized, and then, okay, you've written it down, let's not use it. He then quotes Washington, who maintained that the invisible hand of God brought the nation through the trials of the revolution, and that Washington's words applied as well, if not more, to the recent struggle for, quote, our national existence. He says, looking back upon the last 4 years of deadly strife, but crosses out what he had written next, and down upon the monster rebellion crushed beneath the feet of a victorious people, never again to raise its hydra heads, and urges on a replacement new page his and all citizens' responsibility to welcome and be reunited with, quote, erring brethren, end quote, in one nation, externalizing the outcome of the war to God's plan for the healing and continuance of the nation, as Washington saw God's plan for the beginnings of the nation. Reverend Dorr had years before refused the bishopric of Maryland in order to remain at Christ Church with its mantle of American history and the famous among its congregants and those buried there. The memory of Bishop White, who had been the chaplain of the Continental Congress and then of the Senate and one of the worthies of Philadelphia life. Reverend Dorr held steadfastly to preserving the nation's church as whole as possible and continued at Christ Church until he retired in 1868. The end of his life came in 1869. And the only other thing I would like to talk about after this is some of the transcriptions I've done with burial records. I've been working on volume 4 of the Second Presbyterian Church Records. And lo and behold, what should I discover on page 15 but the beginning of a whole sequence of things on expenses and upkeep costs for the church. And I stared at it and I thought, oh no, accounting, do I want to do this or not? And I thought about asking to skip it, but I thought, okay, just type a page and see what you think. This is a page for 1818/1819 with a number of things to point out, that there are different spellings, ways to spell hickory. For instance, first instance I see towards the top of the page spells it as kickery. The first letter is a K, as is the internal, one of the internal letters, also a K. They can't be different. And then hickory with 2 R's spelled down towards the center bottom of the page, and then another spelling. It changes depending on, there were several scribes who seemed to work on these records, and it changed, the spelling can change from page to page. We get, these records turned out to be unexpectedly interesting, and they've sent me to the internet over and over again to find out about things if I could. We begin to get a few names of people and agencies that the church dealt with for some of its repairs. One was Sellers and Davis. They bought lots of things, lots of cleaning supplies from Sellers and Davis, and they bought sometimes their sperm candles, sometimes their black lead. I had to find out about sperm candles and black lead, which was used for polishing. It was graphite. Then We used fractions of a cent. You'll see prices recording in 12.5 cents. Half cents came in during the 1790s, and they were used until 1857, come to find out. And I think they turned into a nuisance. You get odd echoings of 3, 6, 12 breakdowns of costs or settings of costs for things, which goes back to the old pounds, shillings, pence money supply that we had back in the 1700s. And just to mention a few things. Oh, I forgot the most important thing that I was going to talk about. Towards the bottom of this page, there is an entry for 1M, capital M, cut lax. And I thought, well, what is that? And I thought the M, because it had a bar through it, was crossed out. And I put in a deletion note and rearranged everything. And then I started reading in subsequent pages about 1,000 rot tax. And I finally went to the internet and discovered that cut tax were actually, they were partially machine made, partially hand finished tacks, TACKS. And they, I figured that the M must be the Roman numeral for 1,000, which was used in this instance. And if anybody knows otherwise, please let me know. But it took me a number of days for the penny to drop on that one. But I was glad to go in and take out all the things that I had input that were wrong, including guesses in brackets, which I was very glad to expunge. They would have been ludicrous. I would just like to mention, we don't have to see it, but on page 16, continuing 1819, there's an entry for July 3rd. Paid Mr. Wilson for burnishing and taking the bruises out of the christening cup. We paid him 50 cents. I have often thought of that entry just to think about how the christening cup might have been bruised. Some little child kicking up at it or deciding he really didn't want to be, want to have water poured on his forehead in wintertime or whatever. It just kind of leaped out of the page at me. And then another entry for 1820 was for four purse poles, PURSEPOLES, with copper ferrules, and they were varnished by the people at the church. And I finally decided, I had looked in church supply houses for things that might be relevant, and I decided that they were some form of collection device for the offerings, and that you reach them in along the pews, and they must have had bags at the ends rather than baskets. And I thought that was interesting. There again, if anybody else has another idea, please talk to me, because I have a lot of unexperience still with all of this and learning all the time. Thank you.
Well, Jean, you're just a wonderful example of how you start something thinking you're just dealing with the burials of long gone people, and all of a sudden you're ending up in a whole new category. But I'm so glad that it didn't deter you from tackling the accounting records, because these accounting records really do give us a surprising sense of life in the past. And Karen Hoover has been working on our pew rents. Pew rents, as many of you may or may not know, was the way in which churches made their money in the past. You would rent your pew for the year, or actually you probably would rent it for 6 months at a time, and people would come around and collect, and you paid for a certain number of seats within that pew. And the interesting thing to me about these pew rent books is that with the baptismal, marriage, and burial registers, we know who came into the city for their life events. Because you might be baptizing people in Philadelphia that actually lived in Frankfurt, or they lived in Oxford or Germantown or wherever. The people who are paying to rent these pews presumably live within the surrounding neighborhood of the church and show up on a fairly frequent basis. On the other hand, it's not something that apparently is collected very easily all of the time. And sometimes, of course, people move away. So Karen has been struggling through these books, and we'll let her tell you about them.
I started with the pew rents for Christ Church in St. Peter's in 1802 and 1803 is where I began. And kind of just in a nutshell, what it boils down to, it's akin to translating a phone book. But it's so much more interesting, so much more fun. If you're familiar with the McElroy city directories, you can find out who lived in the city on what street, and you can put people together. But with the church pew rent books, they're all written by hand, so they're so much more personal. You can tell who sat with who on a pew month after month, year after year. You can I've been able to trace some genealogy through that. What's fun about it is all I've got are names and dollar amounts. There's no mystery or intrigue, it's just names and dollars. But there's fun old names. There's Murgatroyd and Rambo show up quite often through the list, in addition to others. Quaker names, there's 3 gals that pop up in each of the books: Peace, Patience, and Praise. So you get a different side of the city with that. Something else that's kind of funny, I think you see Captain so-and-so, General such and such, and doctors' names. And I know they're out there with the, I don't want to call them everyday ordinary, but I've been blessed to find my great-great-great-great-grandmother in a pew sitting in amongst the doctors and generals and captains and historical figures. One thing I find that's also kind of amusing is how many women who have their first name of widow. In one particular case I know, again, it was a family trace that I've done, is they had her name in as Elizabeth for several books, and then she became a widow and they changed her name to Widow. Why they couldn't have just left it as Elizabeth is beyond me. But it makes it tough if you want to track people down genealogically, but the last name is still there. And quite a few other women are named as Mrs. One man was a Mr. What few of the things that pop in there once in a while, there's little comments, as Carol has said, there's some of them in some of the older books, not the one I'm doing, but they say, can't get money out of them, will not pay, refused, we gave up, you know, the people just wouldn't pay. But also included in there are street addresses sometimes, Ray Street, Market Street, Elfreth Alley was one. And yesterday, number 61 South 2nd Street. So you can get an idea if you're doing any kind of historical research or genealogy work. The pew rents actually have some fairly good stuff in there. It's an old style of writing, it's the old cursive. You get used to the reading of it pretty quickly. After a while, it doesn't take you much, but I was not familiar with the long S, so that was my screw up that I needed to go back and fix. But otherwise, you get pretty familiar with it. It goes pretty quickly. One thing I would like to say with doing this, you're never in this alone. There's always someone that has come before you. So if you're struggling with trying to identify some words, and in my particular case, the first place I go is the prior transcription database. That people have done work before. I'm not quite sure the spelling of a name. I want to make sure it's right because these are going to be machine readable and searchable. So there's a database before me that I can go take a look at and find family names. Something else, if I can't find them in there, it's maybe they're just more current in 1800, they weren't in the 17s. You just look at a previous pew book. And if it's smudged in this record, it's probably clear as a bell in the previous record. So that helps with a lot. But I'm going down this road because some of the names I can't decipher at all. I'm not too good with the names of Philadelphia history, a few, but not enough. And what I do is I just take what I think I have spelled correctly and I go Google it. But I'm just fair and ample warning for anyone that wants to do pew receipts, because you go find that name on Google, the next thing you know, you've got a Wikipedia article, and 20 minutes later, you've read the life history of this person. And then I realized I haven't done any transcription. So it's lots of fun, believe it or not. I mean, it's like I said, going through a phone book, but it's fun. The names are interesting. I found it a great way to give back. I've been a huge beneficiary. Here's the phone. A huge beneficiary of public records, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey church and town records through Ancestry. And it's just beyond belief what I've been able to find. So for me to come back to do this and be able to touch hands with it and see the people that are in there. So anybody that wants to be able to find family members or contribute, it's been a great way. Like I said, it's a fun phone book, but it's a fun phone book.
Thanks, Karen. One of the other pieces that have come out of these pew rent books, which I just think is fascinating, is for many years we thought that the seats in the galleries of, say, Christ Church were reserved for enslaved people, criminals or the poor or whatever. And in reality, when we started looking carefully at these pew rent books, we realized that it really wasn't a lot cheaper to sit in the gallery. It was about the same price as sitting on the main floor. So my suspicion is, frankly, that, you know, the gallery might have been a little warmer. You could take a nap a little more easily, whatever. But certainly it was not the cheap seats, so to speak. Matthew Barger has been working on two different sets of records: the David Daly Diaries, the missionary who had the Eastern Shore Circuit that I mentioned the other day, and the First Baptist Church record. So I'll let Matthew talk about his efforts with this.
Yeah, I'll begin with some of the David Daly Diaries. I began transcribing these when I first joined the project earlier this year, and the primary time frame for his diaries was around 1810 to 1820, so like that decade there. And it's interesting to see the life cycle of an itinerant minister at the time. He went on traveling circuits among the Methodist denomination and did a lot of revivals and preaching and speaking in that way. And so going through that, you can see, particularly in the year 1812, when the War of 1812 was going on, he notes that there's anxiety about what's going on around that time, and that colors kind of the message that he brings and stuff. And so it's interesting to see the historical connections between like national history and this particular life here in David Daly. In addition, you can just kind of see what life was like for the people at the time, particularly for a young traveling minister, and it was really interesting to transcribe. More recently, I have focused my attention on the minutes of the First Baptist Church, and in the year, I believe it's 1781. Yes, in the year 1781, particularly in the first half of the year, the church had brought on a minister to supply the pulpit, and he ended up preaching the doctrine of universal salvation. And so for a span of 4 or 5 months, the leaders of the church that are opposed to this doctrine of universal salvation, they kind of protest against, I believe he's recorded as Elhanan Winchester, and this will be around pages 40 and following. And so for a span of 20 pages in the record and 4 or 5 months, there's disputes in the church. Half the church believes in universal salvation, half the church does not. And they go and consult the founding documents, and as well as bring in the Baptist Association to try to help mediate. But there seems to be a lot of difficulty here since it's a pretty even split. And so it just takes a long time for this issue to be resolved. And when I was transcribing minutes, I was like, well, this will just be church business. It'll be, all right, so-and-so was baptized and had joined the church. And there is some of that, but there you run into church drama as well in the transcribing the minutes of the church. And so just seeing that, how this church went through wrestling with a pretty significant theological issue, I believe was insightful, both to look and see historically how they handled it, and also to think about churches today that deal with issues that they would consider significant. In a sense, kind of looking at a record like this and seeing how a church in the past has done it can help us to reflect and say, in some ways, we would want to follow this example, and in other ways, we might not want to. And so as one who's studying for ministry that I found those ideas really insightful.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I'll tell you, these First Baptist minutes are really amongst the chattiest. They are rivaled only by the Gloria Dei records. So if anyone really, we were talking yesterday at our coffee hour about how really history is just gossip. And if you want gossip of the day, these records have it in full spades.
Yeah. And as I was transcribing this, I realized that this was coming from the perspective of those that held to a more traditional notion of salvation, and they are ultimately the ones that ended up winning the argument. And so I wonder what would have been like to read what the perspective of the other side throughout this issue. But alas, we don't seem to have records of such. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And thanks for sharing that. So now you've heard from people who've been working with these records for a while. And for those of you who are just going to get started, Alan Hasbrook, who is in charge of this whole transcription effort, developed our transcription guidelines based on Library of Congress standards. And Alan is going to share some of that with you now.
I have what is going to seem like a fairly technical presentation here, and I hope it's not too burdensome for those of you who have some experience doing these transcriptions. But I think if we take a look at some of the highlights and some of the touchstones in the what amounts to a style guide, it'll help all of us. The style guides were not, they didn't spring wholly formed from this CLIR project. We stole them, frankly. We stole them from the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress has a vast crowdsourced transcription program called By the People. And they, of course, have developed a lot of very thoughtful guidelines on how to handle that. And we simply took the guidelines from the Library of Congress, from that project, and adapted them to the Philadelphia Congregations project we're all involved in now. So the basis of it is very well formed. Library of Congress is a worthy organization, and we're standing on their shoulders as far as the procedures and styles go. I'm going to share my screen now. We want to take a look, and I thought for the benefit of the people who are new to this project, I wanted to make it clear where the entry point is. Now, this is the home screen for Philadelphia Congregations. And if you go to Help Transcribe and drop down to Getting Started with Transcriptions, there's a good set of instructions on how to break into this project, how to register your credentials, your username and your login and so forth, how to tell whether a given record is available for transcription or whether somebody has already done that. So take a look at that if you're starting out on this project, and you, I think, will find it very useful. I'm going to back up one level now to the home screen, and we'll come down to the other item under that Help Transcribe, and that is the set of transcriptions, the guidelines that we want to talk a little bit about today. I have to confess too, in reviewing this set of guidelines and preparation for this presentation, I found some things that need to be updated. So I'll try to point out a couple of the significant ones. There's an overview we're not going to spend any time about, but I want to talk about the big conflict. And this is something that can provide you with the guidance on how to deal with some of the uncertainties you're going to encounter in these records. The big conflict is a set of two conflicting guidelines, two imperatives really, that we all operate by when we're transcribing these records. And of course, the first imperative is to transcribe these records exactly as they are originally. We don't want to make any changes. We don't want to correct spelling. We don't want to correct punctuation. And it's tempting at times because in the 18th century and the early 19th century, there just were no conventions in spelling. Almost everything that didn't have an already established spelling was spelled phonetically. There were weird abbreviations. We'll go over some of them. You leave them as they are. However, the competing imperative and the conflicting to some extent imperative is that these records need to be searchable by modern search technology, by modern search logic. which means that there has to be a correct spelling by modern conventions of any name. And my favorite example comes directly from the Library of Congress, and we will take a look at that. So there are ways to balance these two conflicting imperatives, and very often it involves something called the tag. There are a whole collection, a whole library of tags that will be described in this document that will offer you a way around the conflict between the two imperatives, the big conflict. Here's one of the big ones. This one I love. This comes from the Library of Congress. Somebody out there in transcription land was transcribing a document that had Abraham Lincoln's name spelled as Ace Blinken. Not quite on target. So you can imagine what would happen if someone were searching today in a whole text search on a computer for Abe Lincoln. They're not going to hit it. But the way you solve that is to take the correct spelling and put it in square brackets following the misspelling. So that solves both, it solves the issue and meets both objectives. It preserves the original and it provides a modern searchable term, the correct term. So that's a major way around this conflict we have. Keep that in mind. A word about formatting. This is pretty much archaic. Initially in this project, we had to ask people to use a word processor of some kind to prepare the transcriptions, and then we imported them into the database. That's no longer necessary. I think, as you all know now, the transcriptions are done online. You can type the transcriptions directly into the website, save your work when you're finished, and it's all done. One thing I did note, there was a question in the chat about using a tab character. Someone was trying to use a tab character and it was messing up the alignment, the horizontal alignment. That's not something you should use. Tab characters are not part of the character set that this editor that we're using can accommodate. You want to use spaces, no tabs, just spaces. If you're trying to do a column or alignment, you just have to keep tapping the tab space until your characters align properly on the transcription screen. Are there any questions to this point? Okay, we'll continue. We don't want any hyphenated line breaks. You can read that for yourself. One of the principal tags that we use and is available to us for as kind of a universal purpose is the editor's note. And here's the editor's note. It begins, for example, in this example, there's a verb missing in the original text. So I need to note that there's a verb missing. It's not a transcriptional error. It's just there's no verb in the original document. So the editor's tag begins with a square bracket, uppercase ED, and a colon. And then whatever notation you want to make, if it's a description, if it's the addition of some explanatory information or something out of current information that would be helpful to someone reading this transcription, put it within the editor's note. And then, of course, conclude the editor's note with a closing square bracket. Another thing that I actually discovered only on Monday was a strange behavior. It was strange to me because I wasn't anticipating it, by the deletions tag. And I have an example of that. When there is a deletion, whether it's a struck through deletion or something's X'd out, and if it's deleted in the original document in any way, you want to notate it as something that has been deleted. If it's legible in the original document, it belongs in the transcription, but it's important to note that it was deleted in the original transcription. And the way we notate that is this deletion tag, and it shows up differently. Let me take a look and show you something from the Bishop White transcription of Bishop White's journal. This is an account of the creation of the Pennsylvania diocese, the Episcopal diocese. And as you can see here in the upper part of the screen, in the original document, there are a number of terms that are lined out. So if we come down here and look at the transcription, you can see that those terms are correctly struck through. However, in your original style book, there is no prescription for doing struck through text. It's just not something that the transcription character set can accommodate. So what happens there, I'm going to edit this. Now you can see it when the transcription is open for an edit. I'm going to click on edit, and there you can see there's the delete tag. So we can see that in the original transcription, the the word resolved is deleted. The word whether is deleted. The term shall now is deleted. All of that tracks with what's in the original record. And as you enter it, this is the way you'll enter it, with a square bracket, DE colon, then the deleted term and a closed square bracket to complete the tag. However, when you store that text, let me come down here and save that. There will, it's a process in the database world, in the computer world, called tokenization. It takes that string and converts it into a properly struck through term. But you can't do the strike through directly. You have to use the tag, the delete tag, to accomplish that. Beyond that, you will find situations where you need to provide a proper current noun, particularly in proper nouns, names particularly. I'm thinking of Jacob Duché, who was a rector of Christ Church, who was, I suppose, a French Huguenot, and spelled his name D-U-C-H with an accent, acute, I guess, as a right-leaning accent. And I've encountered at least a half a dozen variations on that spelling, including D-U-S-H-A-Y, a straight phonetic. So the solution then around our big conflict, the big paradox, is to keep the original misspelling and add the correct spelling in brackets so that it becomes searchable. I think probably that's, there's one more thing I did want to touch on, and that's abbreviations. You do have leave. Normally you don't have leave to change anything in the original text. It has to be transcribed letter for letter as it is. However, there are some abbreviations, particularly those that include superscript characters. And there's a set, some of which I think you'll recognize, you know, ye old smoke shop. The article, the definite article, the is abbreviated, and that's a common abbreviation. Fortunately, there's no question about what it means. Why over superscript E? There's not going to be any superscript in the character set we use for the translations. So you've got leave, and it's almost an imperative to translate that into THE. And same with a lot of the honorifics, Dr., Mr., Monsieur, Junior, they all get translated to something that's searchable, but more than that, that's comprehensible. The long S is another thing that we must change. There's no character set for the English long S, which I think bears some relation to the German. The Germans use a long S too, but that's beside the point. These are English long S's, and unfortunately they got to go because there's no long S in the translation database either, the character base. Currency is going to be a particular problem. There are all kinds of currencies available. I heard one of the transcribers mention a 12.5-cent entry, and it sticks in the back of my mind. I had a very interesting seminar a couple of months ago on 18th century currencies, and there are a million of them. And that 12.5% is based on an old Spanish currency, and it was commonly called a bit. You know, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar. So a bit was based on the eighth of a dollar, in a Spanish dollar, and it was commonly used as a 12.5 cent. It's just crazy. I mean, it drives our job just over the edge sometimes. Similarly, there are English currency here. There are also Pennsylvania pounds, so there's a Pennsylvania variant of that. And at some point, mostly after the revolution, I'm sure, the churches started to record their currencies in dollars rather than pounds. But you know, this is something you need to spend a little time in. This section of the spelling instructions, if you're going to do anything that involves currency, because if you make some sense of this, it will fall into particularly the pound notations, but it has to be fairly explicit. And there again, you may have to change some of the things you find in the original documents. Columns and tables, here we go, use spaces, not tabs. That's another reminder to confine yourself to the character set that the transcription software can handle, and that does not include tabs. And that's basically it. I encourage you all to spend a little bit of time with this set of instructions. I spent some time preparing for this presentation and discovered a lot of things, including that there really need to be some updates. But I think as far as it goes here, with the exception of the the instructions to use a computerized word processor, I think that it's fundamentally accurate. Let me know if you see anything to the contrary. Do we have any questions?
Well, there's one here, Alan. When would you use an editor's note with brackets as opposed to just brackets?
Anytime you want to insert a notation, it's a true editor's note. It's something that you want to add, something that you want to correct. I think the example we saw was if there's a verb missing in a sentence, you want to do an editor's note saying, you know, there's no verb here. That too will become searchable, but the plain square brackets without the editor's note was just to add a correct spelling, for example, of Jacob Duchesne's name or a proper noun. So the editor's note is kind of an all-purpose tag. And sometimes there won't be a clear answer, and you will just have to keep this grand paradox, you know, the tension between preserving the original and making it searchable. And you'll have to use your common sense in how to proceed, how to resolve that conflict. There's nothing formulaic about these old records.
And going back to the chat questions, and I noticed that someone started doing pages without tags, then put them back in and tried to get back in, but got the message about the page being edited. Walt, do you want to go back over the, I know that when you are working on a page, so that no one else can go in and work on your page and override your work, it's indicated that it's locked for editing. So you might have to wait 15 minutes or even a little longer before you go back in and try to fix that. I was going to ask Walt for that, but it looks like he's sort of tied up here. But hopefully I got it right.
Give me 1 second and then I'll get to the question.
Excellent. And then the guide for reading old handwriting. I don't know of one, but I'm certainly happy to start looking around for it. Does anyone else? Has anyone else seen anything like that?
I don't know of anything that's available to us as a reference resource, but I have heard by the grapevine, I haven't seen any discussion of it on my technical sites, that in Europe there is under development an OCR, an optical character reader piece of software that supposedly can read handwriting. I suppose it has to be at least marginally legible handwriting, but it can handle script handwriting, which is something a lot of grade school kids these days can't do because they're not teaching cursive anymore.
Okay, I'm back. I know there were some questions here. One of the things I pulled up, if I can share my screen, is the Absalom Jones register, just to see what the tabular stuff looks like. So give me a second here. So can you see the register that's up? Okay.
Yes.
This is the tabular stuff is not always easiest for transcribing. But again, we really want to stick with this plain text. I know it has its limitations, but it has its purpose. And in this case, what you're using is spaces to make sure that things are aligned as best as can be. So if you press tab, you're right, all kinds of crazy things happen. That's just a feature of the browser because when you press tab, it moves in the browser to the next field, which would be the transcription is complete checkbox. So tab doesn't work for you. But spaces work to separate the columns here. And really it's just an attempt to do it in a way that is readable. When this is displayed, it will display with this fixed width format. So each space, just like an old typewriter, each space has its own width and the things will line up the same as you see it on the screen here. So if I needed to push stuff over, I can space it over, backspace, etc., and just line it up as best you can with the original that you're looking at. If you have trouble with it, if it displays weird, my first suggestion is try another computer or try another browser. sometimes a browser will do weird things with text like this, and maybe it's not displaying correctly. So just get a sanity check, and use, if you're using Chrome, try Firefox. If you're using a Mac, try a PC, or just somebody else's computer. Say, hey, let me see what this looks like. And we've discovered a couple of things where it was a particular computer that just wasn't displaying properly, but otherwise the text looked fine. If you try to, so I'm editing page 15 here. I'm going to open up a second browser tab here and try to edit page 15 again. You'll see that it won't let you. And it'll say, this page is being edited, try later. You simply have to wait about 15 minutes and come back in and try again. What it does, this is to keep somebody else from editing this and saving over your work so that you don't lose work that you've started. So if you see that note, this page is being edited, try later. It could be you, it could be somebody else, but it just needs that pause so that you don't accidentally save over your stuff. So if I try to edit this, it'll give me the error, right? But as soon as it's saved over here, if I've saved it and now it's closed, I would be able to come in here. If I refresh the page, I'll be able to edit it right here. Okay, so it's just something where if you hit that situation, be patient, come back, and you can always move on to the next page. Make a note that you can come back to that page to work on it, but you can move on to the next. Some hints here, when you're doing transcription, remember to switch to the single page view, because if I'm looking at 2 pages, it's hard to know which one's page 15. Okay, so switch to the single page view. And then when you go to work on a transcription, like this is page 16 that I might want to work on, click that jump to image and it'll make sure you're on page 16. Okay, so I know it's easy to get text mismatched. So you put it in and you typed it, but it's accidentally on the wrong page. A lot of that can be avoided with these 2 things. Simply switch to the single page view first. And then when you get ready to start a transcription, just make sure you click this jump to image and it will make sure you're on the correct page. It's not going to, the viewer's not going to prevent you from moving around as you transcribe, but that jump to image makes sure you're on the right page. Okay, so 2 hints there. Now let's look at the chat window and see what other questions there were. So I can't see it for some reason. There we go.
One of them, Walt, is there on a PC, is there a font style and size that should be used? Isn't it automatic?
It is. So you don't have to choose any font size or style. When you go into edit, it should look like an old typewriter font. You can use your browser's zoom. So this, if you look in your menu at the top, you should have a zoom option. And you can make things bigger, especially if you've got a really large screen and you want to make things bigger. You can do that. But again, sometimes that does weird stuff with the alignment as it tries to wrap around. When you go to edit though, I'm still editing that one in the other window. When you go to edit, you should see it formatted neatly though.
So Walt, while you're still in this document, there's a question is, do you need to indicate separate columns, like first column for tabulated information?
No, so in this case, we don't have any lines between them, but we took the kind of the layout of the page and just did, the title at the top, and then the column headers here show up in my first row, and then I line stuff up underneath. So we're not marking columns or column breaks. You're just laying out the text on the transcription like you see it laid out on the page.
So then Jane wants to know, she notices that some of the entries have only some pages of a document transcribed.
Mhm.
Should we assume that someone is in the middle of working on that document, and should I find one that has not begun at all?
It's entirely up to you. You can look and see the date here that the page was saved. So if it's been a couple weeks, obviously somebody's not actively working on it. Feel free to keep going. And in Absalom Jones here, you've got an interesting setup because Florence did a bunch of pages, but you've got back and forth. So Leslie Edwards did a page, Florence Harrington did a page, Leslie Edwards did a page, Florence Harrington did a page. So it's something where if a page says it's unavailable, move to the next one. And if it gives you the edit box, you know that that's yours to work on. So you can do that if you like. The other option is just to move 20 pages further in the book and start work there. But that way you can work on what you want to work on without being worried about stepping on somebody else's toes.
So Carrie wonders how you might refresh in this platform.
So easy way to refresh is just in your browser refresh. And then it will reload the page text. Even though somebody else's work isn't instantly showing up on your screen, when you go to click edit, it will give you that protection. So if you come to what looks like a blank page here and click edit, if somebody else is working on it, it will say, this page is currently being edited by somebody else, try again. So there's still, even though your page wasn't refreshed, you still have that protection. But again, you can just, you can refresh at any time just using your browser's refresh, and that will reload all the page text.
And Carolyn wonders how to make the typing screen wider.
So I'm going to work on that because I can get rid of, this interface is designed for a couple different resources. I'm going to get rid of the sidebar on the left, which will make the screen wider for the transcription. You can certainly make it taller. So a couple things here. This bar between, you can size to make the bottom section taller. And up here, see where it says contents? You can hide that panel away and you can zoom in on the resource. So if you're working a few lines at a time, you can get a nice big box for your transcription, along with, let me go here, along with a clear view up top for a line of text. So you can arrange the page as you see fit using this splitter bar here and kind of putting the panel in on the left, and you've got a nice wide view there and a good space below to do the transcription.
And now Robin is asking if we recommend that you do the transcription in Notepad, then cut and paste, or work directly in the system.
I think you can work directly, and it's up to you. If you work directly in the system, the thing you can do, you can save and then kind of re-edit. This transcription is complete box down there really is the guide. So if let me just start page 23 here. I'll start at the top. So even every couple lines, if you want, you can save it and then click edit again and keep going. So that way you're not in danger of losing a half hour's work. No, every couple minutes you've done a couple lines, hit save, hit edit again, and you're right back in. And then when you're done, when the whole page transcription is done, check off that transcription is complete and save it that final time. It doesn't lock it. If you made a mistake, you can still come back in and fix it. But that transcription is complete indicates to other users and to the staff that that page is done, that you've transcribed everything there is to transcribe on the page. I saw a question about when to use ED as opposed to just brackets. in the style guide, there's a couple things. You can, if there's a word you can't read, you can use the brackets with a question mark. If you're trying to interpret, you know, if Abraham, you know, Lincoln was spelled horrendously, you can simply correct it in brackets afterwards. Copy what's there, but then put the correct spelling in brackets afterwards. Where you use the ED is really when you're providing a note that is not in the document. So a simple correction is just in brackets. Something that's unclear is just in brackets with a question mark. But the ED is really where you provide a note. This section of the page is stained and the text is unreadable, right? That has nothing to do with the content on the page, but really is an editor's note indicating something about the document that either makes it hard to transcribe, or maybe there's nothing on this page, and that's an example in our style guide. You know, there is no text to transcribe on this page. You can indicate that so that somebody coming in afterwards, you know, will see that you did indeed do this page, but there was nothing to transcribe on it. So those are the kinds of notes that you can put in an editor's note. It's not a simple correction. It's not marking something as unclear. It's providing commentary. And we have that feature in there because it's important that things like this be noted so that people coming after can see it. But at the same time, you know, since it's more than just a simple correction, we have that ED to mark it as an editor's note.
So now, I guess we have a question saying, if the document is partly in a non-English language, how should we handle this? For example, with the Mikveh Israel records.
So if you can, very simply, the first step is to transcribe as written, right? So I'm not sure the standard practice for writing, you know, Hebrew characters in a Roman script. But if you can transcribe it as written, transliterate, I guess is the right word, that's what you should do. If you can also translate it, you can put that translation in brackets after the other language. So, you know, if it's a whole page in Swedish, I would transcribe, you know, write in Swedish the whole page, and then underneath it, in brackets, indicate, you know, this is a translation of the above page, and then write the translation of the page. So, you know, when somebody reads the transcription, they'll have it as it is in the original, and then in an editor's indication below, they'll have it translated so that they can read it. Does that make sense? So it's just one word, you know, put the translation after the word, just a few words, put it right there. If it's a whole page, do the page in the original and then do the page in English. If you are not comfortable translating, but you can transcribe it, feel free to transcribe it. A lot of times for a word or two, that will work just fine. For a whole page, spelling might be an issue. It might be hard to read the handwriting for a language you don't read, you know, natively.
Question?
But if you can do it, go ahead.
Oh, so for something with completely different characters like Hebrew, so what we enter in should be a transliteration and then a translation after it?
Yes.
Okay. And oh, and can we use Google Translate to get that?
I think that's fair. Part of the difficulty there might be, you know, language that's 200 years removed or out of context might be hard for Google to handle.
Okay, I'm just going to skip other languages. Thank you.
Yeah.
If you find a section that you're struggling with, it might be something that you could send us a note about, and maybe we could find someone who has that ability, and they could go in and work on what you've already done.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and also I was going to mention word reference can be a really helpful use for languages. It's not perfect, but it's better than Google Translate. It enables you to translate from one language to another, so one you know to one you don't know. But it's not perfect, it's just better.
And as Walt pointed out, languages have evolved over the centuries since these records were written, so that could be a little problematic.
And we found even that modern Swedish speakers might have trouble reading the text from then. Modern Hebrew speakers might have trouble reading the text from then. And things, somebody with knowledge, we thought there were Hebrew characters in one of the circumcision books, but somebody who came along said, oh no, they're not Hebrew. It's just he writes his numbers in a weird way, and figured that out for us. And we realized, oh, the whole book is in German Dutch, in a form that nobody comprehends, well, and now anyway. But there weren't Hebrew characters in addition. It was just numbers that we mistook. So sometimes it just takes that experienced eye to say, it's not what you think it is. This is what you're looking at. So feel free to leave notes, as you do that. You don't need to be scared of the documents, but if it's just beyond your comprehension, try something else. And then, as people come and see it.
If you did Hebrew, oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
If you did Hebrew, you'd also have to transliterate right to left, right?
So that's part of the thing I don't know because I don't know it. So if a whole page is in Hebrew, yes, the document's probably right to left, and we have to figure out how that would be transliterated. But mostly these are documents that are in English or German or something that have a couple words or a couple notes in Hebrew, kind of in the middle. So I don't know whether that was right to left in the middle of the other text or left to right. I can't read it.
Me neither.
But we're really working with a Roman character set on a left to right. So in as much as we can do it in that setting, that's what we want to do is get it down to that plain text, Roman characters, left to right. And sometimes that's going to be hard, but we can put in notes, and then provide translations if we can do that.
Walt, we have a couple of questions about how to enlarge the document, zooming in and out. If you could just, since you're on
the original or the transcription?
I believe it's the original.
So in the viewer, you've got plus minus up top here, and you can use that to zoom in and out. You can also use your mouse wheel. So if you scroll up, it will zoom in. If you scroll down, it will pull back. You also have the ability to rotate. So if text is sideways, you can turn the page on its side or upside down using the button up there. Moving around is just simply dragging, just clicking and then moving the document.
Well, there's also a question about ditto marks and the ditto character. Do you just transcribe the ditto or include the words being repeated in brackets?
I would transcribe the ditto. And in general, that's simply, the double quote. So if you have, columns of stuff and you've got, something above, and then they indicate, if they have the ditto mark in the original, you can simply, put that in there. If they write the, abbreviation or some other mark, type that. But if it's just, the two dots or the two quote marks, just use the double quote.
Okay. I think we got everybody out of chat. If I am wrong, please speak up.
For
ellipses.
For ellipses,
Yeah.
Just 3 periods.
Okay, great.
If you have something where And the whole thing, you know, has lots of periods and something like that, right? So it's a list. You don't need to type all those periods. You can do it if you want, doesn't hurt. But in general, we've been ignoring the periods and just lining with spaces. In narrative text, obviously, you know, if it's a period or an ellipse, use the one dot or 3 dots. But if you're trying to line stuff up, don't worry about filling in, you know, all those dots between.
And don't be terrified of this. Just send us your questions as you work through it, because you're going to find things that baffle you. They might baffle us, but we'll do our best to get you an answer, even though it might take a little while. Our next session is going to be the behind the scenes tour of how all of these documents got from the original bound volumes to the images to the web. So that will be the focus of next Monday's session. And then on next Wednesday, Jean alluded to Phil Quigley, who used Reverend Doerr's sermons to as part of his book on Pure Heart, the faith of a father and son during the Civil War. And Bill will be joining us to talk about his use of the records, and we'll be trying to bring in some the words of other historians that have talked about these records in the past. So that's where it's going, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. We hope that you'll enjoy tackling this project, and it'll be fun for you. So please email us with any questions.
Okay.
And we'll see you next
Thank you,
Monday
everyone.
at 10.
See you Monday.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.